The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below. Hey there, this is your orchestration tutor, Thomas Goss, welcoming you to the 10th of these collections, these compilations of website subscriber entries to the 2022 Orchestration Challenge. This is such a cool score. Let's just jump right into it. But first, I just want to mention one little thing, and that is that I have reordered some of these evaluations from the original announcement at the beginning of the evaluation period. So I've decided to spread out this starting from this video, the remaining 14 evaluations over 3 videos instead of 2. I just feel it's sort of piling things up too much to have 7 evaluations in one video. So there will be 5 in this video, 5 in the next, and 4 in the final video for the website evaluations. All right. So getting back into this, it's a very cool beginning. You know, just like all wins. I was hoping for a little bit of variation that kind of moved the emotion forward, like kind of had a bit of an emotional journey through a variation of textures and solo and accompanying strategies from different instruments, right? So the way that this is set up, it's really all like the entire bulk of the emotion rests upon the principal flute player, and that's fine. You know, they're certainly possible of contributing that very powerfully. But still, you know, I think that you are just capable of so many imaginative ideas in the winds that I don't know, just kind of wistfully expecting maybe a bit more variation. That's all I'm going to say. So, you know, in terms of the treatment of the melody representing an emotional or timbral progression, not so much. I mean, gradually over the course of the 10 bars, we have a bit of a timbral progression, but maybe not as much as might have been. Still, it's a very, very cool score. It's neat how you start here with the English horn and the second clarinet playing the harmony way below the flute. So there's no octave, there's no octave tracking from below for the first flute. It's all just melody on top, no octave, and then the thirds below. Now, if you have a second part, right? If the second player is going to be playing, you either put in the first voice rests or mark the part with a number 2. Don't do both, right? Because you're saying, oh, hey, by the way, this is the second part, and then you give us a first voice rest. It's like, yeah, we know that is, right? So if the number 2 were missing, we would be able to tell immediately because of the stems pointing downward and the first voice rest. We would know automatically that is the second voice, right? And then here, you don't even need to mention that this is the first voice on top. It is just assumed, right? Good for you, though, to mark the entrance above, right? Because a lot of people leave that out when another instrument enters the picture. There's a tendency to just like continue cruising on at the same dynamic, and I mean I've done that too in my own score. So I'm not picking on anybody in particular. It's just a habit. So this is the way to break that habit. So nice to have the second clarinet and so on. It doesn't really matter too much whether this is first or second. Good on you for making the second clarinetist's life a little bit more interesting. But if you're working with a community orchestra and you have one instrument, kind of exposed, community or student level orchestra, always give like the single instrument to the first player. Okay, just for absolute security. Sometimes the second player is the student of the first, right? And I find that happens a lot in situations where there are 2 harpists, right? In a score where there's 2 harpists, oftentimes the second harp player is a student of the first, right? And they're for a community level, semi-pro level orchestra, it's rare to have 2 harps. So when it does happen, sometimes like the on-call person that's available is somebody who's moving up in the harpists, as one of the harpist students, and they'll be there to guide them through the process and everything else. And that can also happen at a community or semi-pro concert level with wind instrument players too, and so on. So I mean, it all kind of works together. Here we've got a diminuendo down to pianissimo, and I think you should give your English horn player some guidance here too. Like let them know where they're headed as well, and then re-entering here at piano makes more sense that way. This is kind of cool, coming in here and having the octaves finally between flute and English horn. The 2 instruments have a relationship that a lot of people might not actually guess at first. With English horn, just because of its broader, it's sort of like it has a sort of a slightly, it has a bigger body and a kind of a wider range. An extended lower range, and there's something about that sort of makes their quality of timbre a little less intense than the oboe. So as a result, they can combine beautifully with the flute and almost make you feel like it's an alto flute playing below, right? In a relationship like this. And then when they join together here, you can get a beautiful balance because the English horn is going up into a sort of a thinner, reedier kind of a place, and the first flute is descending to its middle register. Right, so in both cases, both of them are dealing with places where their tone is reduced a little bit, and it works beautifully. So I would just make sure, like, if you really intend people to get softer here, you should write it in. There's absolutely no need for you to maintain this artifact from the piano score. Right, in the piano score, there is a tie. There are 2 tied dotted half notes, just like you have here, but the players don't need to read this in the middle. That was only there because of the pianist, right? To kind of just to really make sure that the player was continuing to hold the notes as the inside voices moved around, right? But there's no need for that here because these players don't really give a damn what the other players are doing, in terms of having to count for themselves, right? It's completely immaterial. So you should just have a dotted whole note here tying to this, right? So aside from those objections, I think this all works pretty well. Yeah, so piano and then crescendo to mezzo forte. See, so check this out. So Miko really gave us a destination dynamic when using those the crescendo mark, right? Which a lot of people didn't just used crescendo and diminuendo, but didn't really tell us where crescendo led to and where diminuendo was going back down to. It wouldn't hurt anything for this to get softer at the end. All right, now here on the next page, things start to open out, and I thought that this was a very enjoyable, very cool interpretation. Like the way that you sort of held off on interpreting or transcribing the left-hand patterns, but instead you had this sort of staggered entrance of the low Ds, right? Just kind of calling to mind that rippling pattern, the figuration, right? And then just having little bits and pieces appear in the clarinet, bassoon, right, violas, and being more about harmony. So what I would just say in this particular approach, while it's very clever and it does kind of simulate what happens in the piano, there's a tendency towards static just because of the held pitches, right? Like the low bassoon and the double basses here just kind of hanging on and pushing onwards. The same thing with the viola note continuing on. So just there's like a slight danger of it feeling a little draggy. However, it's all up to you. You could, for instance, just not have the tie and just have a rest here, right? I mean, there are a bunch of different ways to change things around so that they're not so stodgy, right? I'm not saying this is stodgy, but I mean just that there isn't that feeling of kind of the dragging at the momentum. Now, as far as the other parts are concerned, the horns and the first violins and second violins working together, cantando, that's all good. So it's pretty well set up. The one thing I would say is that like the harp, I see here you're sort of soft pedaling your bassoon. You want the bassoon to be a little softer so it doesn't take over the sound picture too much. I'm not sure that this is all that big of a worry here, but go ahead and leave it in. But the harp, for instance, playing piano and having that, having the rock bottom Ds here and so on, it would really be better for the harpist to play this all with their left hand, just as one octave with one stem, and just not really drag the right hand into it. In fact, it's just because, like, how far down can the right hand reach if the harpist has got shorter arms, right? Generally speaking, I avoid scoring parts for the right hand of the harpist that are below C in the bass staff. I just, I feel that that's a good, safe limit. And of course, many harpists can play lower than that with their right hand, or their right arm, more likely. But like here, there's absolutely zero need for the right hand to be playing this pitch. Just have like this as D octaves with, put the ottava underneath it, just for the left hand, all right? But the other thing too is that I feel that it would need to be more like mezzo piano or even mezzo forte to really, for the effect to really contribute meaningfully when you've got bassoon on top and double basses on the bottom. This will really get swallowed because the lower strings of the harp, we might think, oh, they're really big, they'll have a nice big sound, but they don't. They get really absorbed into the texture of something like this. It's the same thing with like marimba. You might think, oh well, marimbas have these big wooden tone bars, and it'll be easy to hear that during the orchestra playing. But no, the character of the of those tone bars gets absorbed into just about any texture if you're not careful. So just be careful how you write those instruments. All right, so here you're coming in, and I'm not so sure why oboe needs to be mezzo forte. Maybe it wasn't mixing well in your mock-up. Okay, but I think that you're fine with piano crescendo here. But it's sort of strange, like who is crescendoing and where, and who isn't, right? And why not? I think it's interesting that you're holding off on the horns crescendo. I think that that's perfectly fine. That sort of keeps the texture delicate. But I would really have the oboe have the same dynamics as the flute and the upper strings, and maybe even the clarinet having a bit of a crescendo before you get to here. But I mean, holding back on this a little bit isn't a bad idea because you are elevating the middle voice up an octave, right? So it's kind of interfering with the kind of smooth operation that you've got going on here. So keeping it held back a little isn't a bad idea, but it's just a little strange. Anyways, then we have rolled timpani. No, there's no crescendo here. I think you forgot a crescendo mark. Cymbal and bass drum, all good. And then I think that this solo trumpet right here is a nice entrance right here. Bum ba ba. Oops. Yeah. And that will just give brilliance to everything else that's happening right in here. Like the overtones, its overtones will push at the flute and the first violin combination there. And in that case, like the harmony in the middle here being provided by the clarinets, I think really helps a lot. Yeah, and the little pizzicato thing that you've got going on here in the cello is very simple scoring. If you wanted to beef this up a little bit, add bassoon staccato. Okay, and then here this just is going to be smooth as smooth, and nicely done too. So, in conclusion, a very cool score. I didn't see any fatal errors or huge problems, but just maybe some fine tuning is possibly advisable. Maybe the harp could have done a little bit more, but it's still a very cool score. And thanks so much for entering it into this year's challenge. Really, it would be great to see what you came up for the next one, the next three that I have planned. So now let's go on to the next score, which is also very, very cool. Really fascinating score, Carl, and I especially like this beginning here with with our celesta and vibraphone and harp all working together. I mean, it's really a shame that the tremolo here does not convey. It's just very kind of nervous and frenetic. I'm assuming this is Muse score here because like of the gaps between the groups. Like, so whatever's happening here with your bracket, then it should be the same bar line. And like, it puzzles me why MuseScore, ends up with these sort of gap, these gap bar lines. I don't know why, but it just happens. Maybe it's very easy to accidentally dislodge it or something. I thought it was kind of interesting how, like, it not just the things that sounded a little strange in the mock-up, but the things that sounded actually pretty cool in the mock-up, like the celesta combined, doubling the top note of the harp. It sort of sounded a little bit like a harp harmonic with the way that it was scored. I mean, just in terms of general scoring, your phrasing should match in both parts, right? Since they're doubling each other, right? Yeah, you almost don't even need the left hand staff, right? So if there were any questions about vertical space on a page like this, you'd always leave out the left hand staff of like celesta, marimba, harp, and so on. I would be curious to know whether or not you conceived roles here, but you forgot to put them in. I mean, I think it would just give it a little bit more character. I love the delicacy of it though, like how you're not really having very much of a harmonic presence here for the harp. Just those three notes, those little. We're just kind of arranging everything kind of in triads here. And then the exposed note, right? Like when you leave out the other harmonic pitches in the harp, where there might normally be a chord, you just play a single pitch here and there, and that just sort of increases the level of delicacy. And then bringing in the vibes, I thought that was just really beautiful, and I thought it all worked together nicely. If only, I mean, check out. I don't know if this is MuseScore. I don't know if there is a compatibility issue with Note Performer or not. But if Note Performer is working for MuseScore now, then absolutely look into it, because it would have improved the sound of this really, really amazingly, and given you like a better idea of what celesta plus harp sounds like, right? Now here you have the dash ties for tremolo, and I think you just use just a plain old tie, right? And the benefit of that is that, like, on a repeated note, there is like there'll be like a slight, just a tiny bit of a pause between the end of this tremolo and the beginning of the next one, so that there's a sort of a sense of, or there could be just a slight nudge to the articulation. So one way or another, the audience hears this as a distinct note from the previous ones. I completely understand what you're trying to do here, all right, and that's great. I would just use just a standard tie, right? But this is cool, just like leaving off the tremolo to go da da da. I mean, just perfect, exactly right. And the combination then with the vibes and the middle strings works really nicely. And then bringing in the cellos here, yeah. About the only thing I'm kind of missing here is just to bring up on my separate screen here. I got slightly distracted. Yeah, so at the end of the third bar, there is a G that carries forward, right? And since everything is in D major now, right, that would make that pitch a D, right? So if you had perhaps cellos or divisi violas on this D, and you were to hold it through, right, and then do the same thing with the G coming up, right, that is relevant to carrying things forward, then I think that that would actually go a long way, right? So because here, like, you don't hold on to this G, right? You just let everything jump up. But I think that the G continuing on and then eventually joining back up is really, really important. But other than that little nitpick, it's a intriguingly scored passage. I'm not really sure what the use of this long, long, long tie in the harp is. I mean, it'll the harp will have decayed to almost nothing by the time you get to this bar. So, Celesta will, yeah. I mean, so it's always risky with like higher pitches on harp, on Celesta, and so on. Have a tendency to just kind of die away into nothing very, very quickly. So it would almost be necessary if you really wanted these pitches to play a real important role, to play them again or to work them in some other way, right? And it, like, the vibraphone is no help because you're dropping down to this low B. So maybe a little bit of, maybe instead of tying across to here, you could have the Celesta play an octave lower too, and then the harp could also get rid of the tie and play this just as a plain octave between this B and this B. All right, just to kind of keep the presence of that kind of bell-like, harp-like sound in the picture. All right, so here the piece opens up, right, and there's a strong resemblance to other entries that we have seen, but that there are some differences too. It's interesting you're bringing in piccolo here, and that is one of the reasons why this page, this screen, has like kind of a like a real just not really irritating resonance, but just like it has this almost like it has a very, very bright color, right? And that's just because of the piccolo on top, playing softly, I'll grant you, but still, just like the character of it, it just it has a slight orange peeling kind of a sound to it. Then so A2 flutes, doubling oboe. Yeah, so I mean, when you get to a place like this, and the flutes are getting lower and lower, right? They get down to B. The texture is nice and light and soft. So I mean, it's not so horribly bad, but it's just a little kind of flirting a little bit with the margins. I'd say, like, with the oboe right in here, it's really the oboe is what you're going to hear on these on this B, right? And on this B right here. It just really will be more about oboe than anything else. Yeah, but this is all nice right in here. Nicely scored. Then English horn below, kind of carrying the bottom of the harmony with the second oboe. That is just a really nice sound. And then, of course, you've got your first and second violins kind of playing the upper perfect fourth that sort of tracks around on top. So I mean, it all has a beautiful lush sound. I just sort of miss the there's nothing stopping you from having your second violins play divisi and getting both of these pitches, both the second oboe and the English horn pitch, right? Rather than just the second oboe pitch. So you could easily, I mean, you're going divisi here, so why can't you play divisi for these other parts? Now here you say a clarinet, right? And like there's a slight, like, if capital B period clarinet is bass clarinet, then a clarinet could almost be mistaken for alto clarinet. If your clarinet is in A, you do not need to mention it here, right? And you don't even need to mention that your bass clarinet is in B flat, right? So we kind of know. It would be the same thing as like saying, English horn in F, right? So, I mean, if you don't bother to mention it here, right? It's good to tell us that we have A clarinets here, and it's good to tell us that the bass clarinet is in B flat there. But Like here, we don't need the tuning, right? The clarinets are the clarinets. It would be obvious in a part with a key signature that these were A instruments, just from looking at the key signature of D and the and the key signature here of F, right, which is just transposing for an A instrument. So yeah, so just that's a little bit of fussy information for you. Now, interpreting the left-hand patterns, I thought that this was really cool. The way that you have the violas kind of starting the pattern and then keeping the pattern going, and then combining with bass clarinet and yeah, and I just thought that this was just had a beautiful flow to it. The way that you interpret it, it just really kept things moving, and it's a very interesting slurring style. Down, up, down, up, down. I mean, I think that would all work pretty nice. One little note is that the tempo kind of, just really felt slow, and it's like in the piano score, it's like a tempo, then maybe a little bit more, right? So, yeah, what Barvinsky means really is that the beats of the 12/8, like the baton beats, not each individual eighth note beat, but the baton beats of like 1, 2, 3, 4, like the most conductors will be conducting this in 4. That those beats will be the same as the 6/4 beats in the previous section, right? So each of the 6/4 beats, right, which is actually turns out to be not really that slow, right? And then maybe even a little bit more, right? So I feel that this really could have been faster, right, rather than just feeling a little laborious at the slower tempo. Then when things start to get bigger, it actually, it brightens and it's sounding really nice. But this is when the piccolo starts to, just starts to brighten things up quite a bit. So I mean, you probably don't even need piccolo on top of there. Maybe you should take it out and just listen to your mock-up and see whether it might sound a little bit less glaringly bright, right? Because everything else is really soft, right? Now, one thing that's also interesting about the mock-up is that everything is marked piano, but it's obviously playing back in the mock-up at like mezzo forte or forte, right? So it just really has this huge sound, even though you have marked it piano. So that's just something to watch out for, something to think about. Is your mock-up really, and I don't want to get sidetracked with mock-ups, but just to say that like my position has shifted a little bit towards, if you can realism in mock-ups, like using Note Performer or some other kind of thing, where you just get a much better idea of what it will sound like, which of course will be 10 million times better than the mock-up, even if the scoring is not as great as it could be, right? Now here you have the vibraphone coming in, and I think that that's a cool effect, but just, judging by the weight of the orchestra and everything else, you might want to mark up the dynamic just a slightly bit. Like if everybody's playing piano and it really is a piano and not a mezzo forte like it sounds in the mock-up, then I would definitely have this at mezzo piano or even mezzo forte. And it also feels like there's a big crescendo here, but that's probably just because of the pitches rising. But anyways, just a very, very cool score, Carl. And I think you could have, played around with certain things a little bit more. I think that like celesta and harp could have played a bit of a role here, not just vibraphone right at the end, but there could have been there could have been little touches of harp and celesta here, just a little gleam or something else, And and you could have also maybe made the scoring a little, had a few changes rather than the same approach all the way through, all 8 bars, right? And it's just the same as, like, kind of going back to the beginning, same comment I made for Miko, and that is like to, any progression of texture that you could make would not only does it give you more stuff to do yourself as an orchestrator in one of these challenges, but it also it also like takes us on an emotional journey. Now you did have slight changes to the texture, like right in here, adding the vibraphone, leaving off of the tremolo right in here and there, right? So you did have slight changes, but nothing really all that context changing, right? Nothing that really kind of takes us on a journey all that much. It's more setting a scene and kind of letting us look over the landscape rather than really saying, I felt like a certain way here, and then something happened here, and then I felt something differently there, right? So we don't quite get that arc. But all that aside, a very, very cool entry, and using some things that I had totally not even thought of, and that nobody else has so far yet either. So great job there, Carl. So now, with hopes that you will also participate next year, let's take a look at the next entry. All right, Eric. So a very fun entry. I think we can hear in the mock-up the consequences of using the strings basically to just barely sweeten what's going on in the winds and brass, right? So as we could kind of hear there, the like at the beginning, I mean, you can just barely hear the violins. All that they're doing, and viola, all that they're doing is just basically to double what's going on in the wind parts, to just kind of make them a little cushier, right? And of course, if you take it away, it feels a little bit more barren, right? But still, it's a bit of a risk, right? If you had intended this to sound more lush, you should have marked up your string parts to the same dynamic. Now, on top of that, you're using muted strings. And while that does limit a little bit of the sound picture, it doesn't necessarily make the strings softer, but it does really control a certain kind of brightness of character. So, yeah. Yeah, well, I kind of felt like, as far as the harp is concerned, question about whether or not you intend this roll to roll all the way through, or whether both hands are rolling. So the way that you got it scored now, both hands are rolling at the same time, right? So this note and this note will start at the same time on the roll, and this note will end at the same time. If you really intended a roll to go all the way across, then you would have to, you'd have to do something like that, or actually just boost it all the way here to the top, and then, if you do it just right in Sibelius, you can make it look uniform and still have the other roll hidden there and get kind of a rolling effect with both hands. But I mean, this is really something that Sibelius, like cross staff roll marks, cross staff slurs, and other kinds of things. I mean, that I feel that this is way overdue for a massive upgrade. I mean, somebody should be able to to score a cross staff roll, the cross staff roll should stay stuck to the object so that when you move the staff up and down, the roll doesn't move up and down. It remains hitched to the top chord, and then when you score it like that, the playback should roll all the way across, right? I mean, I think I know that that each staff is sort of treated like a separate channel in MIDI and so on, but I'm just wondering if there's some way to manage that. And then right here at the end, this is really beautiful. Speaking of cross staff, I think a slur should go all the way across this, and then you should also have a bit more ritardando here at the end, because it seems a little hurried the way that it's scored. All right, so the basic scoring that you've got here has bassoons playing the harmony, and you take it up kind of high. Like you've got your first bassoon going all the way up to A into the crescendo, right? And it's it is not like the juiciest note for the bassoon. I mean, it's a tenor note, so it has that kind of edgy quality to it rather than being like really smooth, say the same pitch on clarinet. But I mean, if you're happy with that, then that's fine, and it's certainly no difficult note. It's not a difficult note to play on bassoon. Yeah. Now, you may have not watched some of our previous evaluations, so I'll go over this again, and everybody else can just turn off their brain for about 30 seconds. Be careful about just dropping piano-style slurs onto your parts, onto your wind and string parts, right? Because they kind of don't make sense a lot of the time. Like, for instance, like how long are these players at andante supposed to bow their bows in one direction? You're asking them to go, down, up. You know what I'm saying? It's like you really are just giving these enormous long length. It's not a big deal for the wind players to play that long, but the thing is that you're slurring over repeated notes. What does that mean? Does that mean that you intend these to be played kind of very legato and soft? But if you do that, then you lose the shape of the dotted rhythm, right? So you get da. So that's very different from going ta 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 ta. Do you know what I mean? You like by just throwing a big slur over it, we get almost no pulse there, right? Now it's different when the notes are in sequence, and they're going up and down by steps or leaps or whatever. Da 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 dum. You can really hear that dum. When the notes move around, that's one thing, but when they stay in the same place, there just kind of is no definition if you do that, right? So this is something that I put into my 12 common scoring errors video, right? And I was really, I just really wanted people to pick that up for this challenge. So please, Eric, next time you enter the challenge, and by golly, I hope you do, because I can see you're developing skills here as an orchestrator, and I'm just really eager to see when you are mixing craft with imagination and freedom of thought and so on. So I just applied to this growing knowledge of orchestration. I am so eager to see how that shapes up, but please do, check out all of the resources that I recommend. And next year I'm going to have a checklist, right? So that, for instance, one of the things on the checklist is, have you just dropped in have you thought about, reasonable bowing for your string players? Have you thought about, maybe that you shouldn't just drop in long, piano style phrase marks over wind parts and so on. So just please watch that video, check out the resources next time and everything else, all right? And it'll just save me from having to mention it again. Alrighty. But one person told me once that they actually liked the fact that I repeated it because it helped them remember it. So it's all good. All right, so with that out of the way, just going back to the way that this is scored, it's interesting how you bring in, like, you have the held note here in the bassoon, and the clarinet's playing, kind of taking over on the middle voice, and then just changing to bassoons on middle voice as things descend and so on. One thing I'm missing is in the piano part, remember how there was a G that was tied forward? And then when it got to this point in the middle, there was a C sharp that was tied, right? Those notes have to be in there, right? So you got to figure out a way of scoring this. I mean, you could even put a clarinet on it. Like, you could do a voice crossing here with clarinet holding onto the G and the bassoons like playing above it. That would work fine. But you've got to put that back in somehow, in some way. You can do it divisi in the violas, just like I mentioned before in Carl's evaluation that I just did. All right, so while this all works, we're missing the octave, right? The kind of octave Bs. It's fine. We've got octave Bs here, but they're even an octave higher, right? So it's just getting swallowed up by your winds here because it's so soft, right? So if you really had intended for this to be shared, do not worry about having, don't feel like you have to mark pianissimo if your strings are muted, right? Like, you could write triple F with muted strings if you wanted to, right? Just score your strings at the dynamic where everything will merge and mix. So if you had intended this to be a background, then great, then it worked, right? But if you had intended it to be like more sharing the sound picture and you were kind of confused of why it wasn't, well, this is the reason why, pianissimo marking. So I would actually score this at piano, even if you wanted to merge the colors. So I would recommend doing that. Just change this dynamic to piano and listen to it and see what you think. Now here you have kind of a strange, kind of working against the natural playing styles of the instruments. Now, kind of going back to my screen here, just my reference screen. There is not a tenuto mark in the original piano score, and it's fine. You just want to emphasize this note, right? But why slur over it? So the best that the player is going to be able to do is push with their stomach when they get to there, rather than tongue, right? If you get rid of this slur and the player just tongued on the note, and then maybe you can slur B down to E right here. Ta 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 ta, right? It's just so much more convincing. And the same thing here. What does a tenuto mark mean for a string player? It means to have a long zooming bow, right? Just whenever you see a tenuto mark for a string player, and it doesn't have slurs over it, just think of it as a zoom, like zoom, 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 because that's what the bow is doing. It really is zooming across the strings. Okay, and that creates an emphatic sound, which is what you want, right? But when you put a slur over it, it becomes portato, right? So it becomes a nudge rather than a zoom, right? And which doesn't really help the fact that you want to emphasize this note, right? So think about the implications of, and then right in here, once again, you have this big long slur. You have slurs on some parts and not on others, and then here you're slurring across repeated notes, right? So where do we get the emphasis, ta-ta, right? We don't, because it just is. Since you're slurring across it, you know what I mean? So we don't get the da-da-dum. This is great, though, in here. So you could have slurred like this. You could have gone slur, bow, slur, bow. So you get a down, up, right? Beautiful, even kind of exchange of energy right in there. All right, now going ahead here. Now, it's really cool, like, you scored the whole thing. And there's some pages here. I know it looks like a mess. It's because I brought up the staff size in the previous pages. So look, Eric, if you really want, if you put that much energy, that much effort into it, and it's just a monumental amount of effort, then, you might as well support on Patreon and have me evaluate the entire thing, which, those evaluations of the full length piece are going on right now. And I appreciate if you can't afford it, if it's not your bag, if there are other problems with it, that's totally fine. I'm not telling you you have to, but I'm just saying with the amount of energy you put into this, wow, I would have loved to have looked at the whole thing. All right. Now, yeah, so Celesta, you're pedaling it, and it's good. A lot of people don't think to add pedal marks or even any indication of what's going on in a Celesta part. And a lot of Celesta players will just play with pedal just the same way that a pianist would, like when approaching Chopin or Liszt or, Grieg or whoever, or even Beethoven sometimes, obviously intends for things to be connected with pedal even when he doesn't mark it. So yeah, it's strange. Like this is like you are crossing the voices here. Like the right hand is crossing. It's like sort of inside the left hand, but there's like no indication of that to me that you are thinking about that, because this note is the same as this note, right? And then here we're getting even lower and lower right in here. So it almost like there needs to be something that sort of alerts the player that they're going to have hand inside hand kind of playing, right? I just think that if you could work that out somehow would be useful. But that the big problem here is that you have such low Celesta scoring, right? All of this stuff is happening within like the first like the octave from middle C to the C above that or the D above that, because Celesta transposes sounding up an octave, correct? So, but the problem is that is the thunkiest, most unsatisfying part of the Celesta. If you want these notes to really sound beautiful and to ring out and to contribute to the texture more, they should be played on vibraphone. Let's face it, right? Because the Celesta has such a delicate sound, and the more you pile on this beautiful stuff happening, all these functions in these other instruments, the more this disappeared. I mean, harp is also very delicate, but it would do a much better job especially of like playing these octaves, right? You like the way that you have this scored, you could actually have the right hand of the harp playing the octaves up here, right, which is where they sound, right? They could just be going dee 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 dee, right? And they would come through at least for the first half of this screen. And you could either do that as doubling the Celesta, or maybe you could take the Celesta part up an octave, right, where it will be heard much better. But this is just going to, like, you're giving so much responsibility to this part here, to the Celesta, right, where, I mean, it'll be played satisfactorily here by the second violin and the cellos, no doubt. But this will just get completely obliterated, right? I mean, can you hear it in the mock-up very well? Just almost nothing, right? So if everything were boosted an octave higher, right, just score this in treble clef, transpose it up an octave, same thing with this, just take it up, like that, right? If it were scored like that, then you'd have a much better chance of it being heard. But like there's only so much that can happen here because of just the growing pressure here getting to mezzo forte. So what if you had an instrument in the orchestra that could never play louder than mezzo piano, no matter how much you tried? So in order to make it sound loud, the whole orchestra around it would have to be doing something very subtle. So, for instance, in its first big debut, the Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy, the Celesta sounds loud, and it sounds loud in a lot of recordings because of the way they're miking it. They got a mic right up against that thing, right? So you think, oh wow, what a big, big juicy thing. In live performances, the conductor really has to hold back the other players. So just you are misinterpreting the projection qualities of the Celesta, and what's more, like, it doesn't matter. You could mark this fortissimo, and the Celesta still could not really sound any louder than mezzo piano compared to the rest of the orchestra. The rest of the orchestra is mezzo piano, and forget it for the brass if you had brass playing along, right? Which you do, getting all the way up to mezzo forte here. So that's it. That's that is the death knell right here. By the time the brass get, especially with this high sounding, or excuse me, this high written A sounding D, right? That will just blast this out of the water, right? So you're asking your horn player to go way higher there. So that's that. That pretty much spells curtains for the celesta from the middle of the page. Then here the harp, right? The very, very low pitches of the harp are also incredibly subtle and soft. So, they may play a role right in here with the harp marked up to say maybe mezzo piano or mezzo forte. But like going on, they just don't really do anything, right? You would be better off having, maybe a quadruple divisi double basses or something, or triple divisi with arco basses playing this, and then a third divisi part playing pizzicato, right? And that would cover basically what the harp is doing and sound much, much clearer. This is really cool right in here, and we could hear it if it were an octafier, right? So with these really delicate instruments, keeping them in the mid-range when there is a lot of complex stuff happening in the other parts, it's just not the greatest strategy. And did you notice something else here? Yeah, see, so crescendo to mezzo forte. Here's a little word of advice. If you want to use the crescendo marking instead of the hairpin, give yourself a hairpin and then make it invisible, right? So just selecting it and going Shift Command or Control H, right? So now when you play this back, play your mock-up back, you'll hear that crescendo, because like the way that you got it scored now, it just suddenly the strings are loud here without having had any kind of, they just sound unnaturally jolting, right? But, you can take this and you can just basically put it in all the parts, right? I'd move this to here. Right, and it'll be invisible and it will just increase to mezzo forte. So try that in your own score, right? And we also don't have it here in the flute part, which is one of the reasons why you kind of can't not hear it starting. Okay, so so let's talk about, I spent a lot of time talking about instruments that will be difficult to hear, and just to kind of get back to that, really, it's hard to hear anything except for the horn, the way that it is scored. It's a beautiful solo, by the way, just really gorgeous the way that you've got it. But did you notice how the clarinet just kind of disappears into the overtones of the horn here? And I mean and then speaking of which, the strings, same exact thing. They really are getting sucked up by the sound of the horn solo. So, I hate to say it, but I think that these parts could all be piano, right? And then you would get a much better mix. And I'm assuming that they're still muted, right? I mean, if they're not, then you have all this time to take the mutes off. Maybe they don't need to be muted. Now, here, I notice you have divisi, all right, which is good, and then you've got split stems. Now, there is nothing about this part, until you get to here, which is a unison, there's nothing about this part that has any differentiation between the voices, right? They could all share the same stem, right? And the fast way to do that is just to select everything in Sibelius and go Command 1, right? So this is probably what that should look like. Sorry, not Command 1, Alt 1 or Option 1, I meant to say. So that's how it should look. It's just, the other way. I mean, it's fiddly. It takes up vertical space. It doesn't really help the player one way or another. Your string section does divisi so much that they are used to reading the top note or the bottom note of an interval, right? Just almost almost automatically. But if there are two separate voices going on in the same staff for any length of time, like say, or not any length of time, any extended length of time, say maybe 5 to 6 bars, then put them on separate staves. Like for instance here, you just completely. I said, see now the separate stems is fine because of the way that this is scored. That's all good. And that saves you from having to say, divisi, unison, simile, blah blah blah. You don't have to do that. Just go, divisi, and then just have the two stems. That's perfectly fine. Yeah. Now here, I'm not so sure that you need to push your basses up that high, right? I think that they can dovetail right on this E here. I think that to the cellos. I don't think you need to have notes that overlap that far. All right. So now we really talked a lot about different little issues, but the scoring itself, if everything was a little louder in the other parts, there's a certain magic to the way that you've scored it in the mock-up, right? Just really soloing out the horns, but that is going to happen anyway. But I like the interpretation of the left-hand patterns. You do not need to do this, right? It would be better for you to join together with, don't put in these gaps. These gaps are here because you aren't thinking about the middle voice being part of the flow of the left-hand patterns, right? So if you do, then this could be a C or an E, right? This to fill in this rest, and then you have then right in here you could put in that D in the viola part, and then you have this beautiful flowing line rather than did it. Right? It was sort of waltz-like, which we kind of don't need, right? So everything should kind of look like this, right? Just a continuous line of eighth notes filling in, using pitches from the middle voice to just keep everything flowing along. But yeah, it's like the string section is so active here and yet so underpowered in the dynamics. And then you have this beautiful stuff happening here on the flutes, which I think works fine with the strings at pianissimo, right? If you take my advice and you boost this, then you might need to change how this works a little bit. Yeah. But I think it could work just, just like you just really have to be much, like you'd have to kind of mark up the flute part. Like this would have to start off at mezzo piano, I think, right? And then get to forte by around here. And then it would balance better with the other things that are happening. But like when you put the oboe, like if you're getting all the way up to A here, written A, and you have the oboes on top as well, then these flutes are just really going to be buried in as you can hear in the mock-up, right? They really don't play much of a role. And on top of that, you've got this middle clarino register note in the clarinet. So it's a bit problematic. It's a beautiful idea, but maybe you need to rethink about how that is scored. All right. So anyway, but it's a very, very cool score. I like this. I love this thing here at the end, all except for this line here of the second flute, right? So have we had this conversation before about not scoring low flute in a place where it gets completely swallowed up by everybody else? Consider that you have first horn playing the same note as second flute, right? So who wins in that contest at mezzo forte? Horn easily, every single time. So this note is kind of thrown away. If you wanted some sort of beautiful blend with your horn, then clarinet is a more likely companion. But even at that, the horn will be more powerful. So you probably didn't even need to put this note in here at all. And it might be better just to have A2, A, if you prefer, A2 flutes right here on this G. And then, as far as this little this function here, it would be better off to give that to your second oboe, where it doesn't get swallowed up by other things. So you don't need this in the second flute either, right? Really think about this, folks. This is like the number one mistake that people make, right? And an error in the sense that you are asking the player to do something which will be invisible and really not make much of a difference, right? I mean, it's playable, but it makes it's a note that's kind of thrown away. Whereas the flute part could really use some thickening up here, if it were playing unison with the first flute and the second flute. That chance is wasted because the second flute is playing something that will never be heard, right? So, just think about some of that thing, all right? Just really, people, stop scoring low flute in places where it's invisible, all right? I mean, this is hard enough with the way that it's scored between, scored against crescendo parts with the horns climbing ever higher, right? But then this is just like, that's the killer right in there, right? So just really watch out for that, please, folks. All right, so, really, really fascinating score. A lot of involved stuff to tweak and to fix, but like the overall effect, I think, of the scoring is pretty positive, and the mock-up actually sounds kind of magical in places. So really great work. I really enjoyed looking at it. So let's just keep this ball rolling and check out the next score. That's a really intriguing interpretation, Frano. I think part of it is made difficult by by the quality of the sound set being almost like it has a sort of a general MIDI kind of a quality to it, like early Garritan or something like that. So I mean, if you can at least get into, say, Note Performer, I think it would hugely improve not just the sound of what you're doing, but also like maybe your perceptions, right? Although it's like, of course, you shouldn't score to the sounds of a sound set, but there's a possibility that your understanding of what you're doing may have been slightly it might be incorrect because of the sound set you're using now, right? Okay, I mean, and there are some simple errors, like, for instance, not tying right here in the harp and the celesta and so on. All right, but the main thing that I sort of see here is, I mean, the approach is not bad, but the problem is more in terms of the balance, right? And also the strength of the instruments and how you're using them. All right, so let's start off from the very beginning. Okay, so the sound set made this sound way worse than it actually is. Like clarinets and celesta and harp and so on. In which the clarinets just really had this almost like foghorn sort of a sound under the celesta and harp, and it's a very delicate texture that you are proposing here. But it doesn't mean that it is impossible, that it won't work or anything like that. Now you need to tell us what key your clarinets are in, right? And also French horn, right? So I mean, obviously horns are almost always in F and so on. So I mean, but it's just customary to say horns in F. And you don't even need to say French horns. We know in concert music, a horn is a horn. So obviously, since this is the key of the piece is in G and the key of the clarinets is D major, these are B flat clarinets, right? So clarinet 1 in B flat, clarinet 2 in B flat. So you just really have to sort of write that in, and it's just yes, anybody who's well trained would get right away what key the clarinets are in, but you still have to write it in. Okay. So that's just some basic stuff. All right, so let's get back to that texture. About the only thing that I could see about this that could be difficult is if the clarinets are playing a little louder, then their overtones are going to be a little uncomplimentary to the celesta and harp. Okay, so I would say it might be better for the celesta and harp to be marked like mezzo piano or mezzo forte, like both of them, right? And then just keep the clarinets at piano. But other than that, I think things will work out pretty good, right? Then it's you come in here with A2, A duet, flutes and oboes, so it's an extremely direct sound, especially for oboe in its lower register, right? It just has a really thick, almost trumpet-like sound. And then, of course, like on this first note, the flutes will be more intense as well, and you're marking them mezzo forte. So essentially, they will be like about 4 times as loud as the strings in the bassoon. Okay, so you just have to watch out. Like, do they need to be mezzo forte? Was that dynamic assigned to these parts because of the balance of your mock-up? All right, see, that's why I'm worried about using. That is the other side, right? You could say, well, don't score to the mock-up, and I think most people would agree with that who are experienced orchestrators. But the other problem is, if you're working with a sound set that is really primitive, it may you may end up bouncing things in a different way just to get things to work, right? And then might get used to that, and then you end up with dynamics that aren't balanced. Like, for instance, in this a reasonable interpretation of this would have very loud winds and incredible, and the with the way that the overtones work here, the violins would really be sucked into the sound of the winds, and you would just barely hear them at all. Now, maybe a little bit more on cello and bassoon, which, by the way, you don't have to say one period bassoon. And you don't need the period at all. Just say 2 flutes, 2 oboes, no period. Don't worry about that. And then don't even say 1 bassoon. Just say bassoon. We get it. It's the same thing as bass trombone or tuba, right? They both have one. And you don't need this. You don't need the brace at all, right? I mean, yeah, you do use them. You do use those instruments in a kind of a bracey sort of a way, but you really don't need it. Okay. I mean, I could see it here for first and second violins. That's sort of customary, but I don't think you really need this. I mean, I would put it here before I would put it here. Okay. But anyway, so this is way out of balance, the way that this is scored, right? It would, you would probably get by just fine and be much more in character with the passage if the winds up here were marked piano, not mezzo forte, right? And then coming back to this conversation, your celesta is still marked piano, right? And all of a sudden you have mezzo forte clarinets and mezzo forte pizzicato middle strings. So how is that supposed to balance? How are we supposed to hear the celesta here? Shouldn't we keep these instruments at piano? Right? Just keep everybody at piano except the celesta and the harp you can have play at mezzo forte. Okay. All right. But, otherwise I would say that this would work if you just balance the dynamics. It's just a cool idea to have the clarinets doubled with pizzicato, but like not all pitches, right? Now, here, I like how you avoid slurring over repeated notes, right? And then you have the slur here, and that's all good. This doesn't need to be slurred, right? Or even tied. It should just be a dotted quarter note, or excuse me, a dotted half note, right? But why are we slurring over this dotted rhythm, right? I mean, do you really want you mean like you just lose all the definition, all the preciseness of the dotted rhythm when you slur over it like that, which and even like setting aside the question of whether or not this is a thoughtful use of the slur or just dropping in the piano slur over wind parts and string parts. Well, not string parts, but over the wind parts here, right? Remember what it said in what I said in the common scoring errors, to not use piano slurs, right? And I mean, it's fine for like a keyboard instrument, right? Here you have a piano slur over a keyboard instrument, and that's perfectly fine, right? And it's fine for harp as well. Okay. So here, like, yeah, once again, it's just going to be very, da 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 da. What if you started off piano, and as you went downhill, you had a little bit of dynamic build so that you ended up at mezzo piano, right? Rather than starting at mezzo forte, just push to here and then go to mezzo forte. Did I say mezzo piano just a second ago? So piano, push towards, get louder here, crescendo to mezzo forte in your clarinets, and then mezzo forte in your winds and strings, and bassoon, right? What dynamic is the bassoon? Why are the slurs the wrong way, right? I think you need to proofread these entries a little bit more. And then here with the horns, yeah, you can keep them soft. But why do they not? I mean, they should all get a diminuendo, including the horns, right? Because you don't want everybody to diminuendo around the horns and end up with the horns being the loudest thing. Now, having said everything that I've said, I do have to say, in addition to all of this, that you are really making this heavy. Right, it just is deliberate. It's just yeah, ba ba bum 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 bum, because you've got half the orchestra playing this, right? I mean, yeah, they're all playing softly, but I mean, how many pitches, do you need to state this idea? And then how many pitches do you need to sit on this final? Like you've got almost everybody in the entire orchestra except for the celesta, right? I mean, how much weight do you really want on this? And then. Yeah, I mean, I like this. This is not Bisbigliando, really. Bisbigliando would be more of a whispering over like a set of pitches. Now with this, I mean, that's not Bisbigliando at all. That is just alternating pitches, right? And just sort of like you would see in maybe that piece by Pierne, right? Or just like a lot of French harp repertoire from about 120 years ago. It's very much in character with that. Don't worry, that's not Bisbigliando, okay? And especially the way that you've got it scored between the two hands and on alternating pitches and so on. Yeah, it's all fine. And this is something that like it's good that it isn't Bisbigliando, because then you can push it up to a forte for the harp, right? And you're not, there isn't anything about this that is going to stomp all that much. Yeah, it's perfectly fine. It's not Bisbigliando. Yeah, and then you have to sort of tell us when you are going back to a duet, right? A2. You have to tell us when that is, because like here you're going, because I think it would just be easier for you to have two separate voices, right? So just have this would have two separate stems on it, right? And then we would have like an up stem and a down stem on this third, and so on. It's just easier to read if it's a situation with winds where you're kind of going back and forth all the time, right? Rather than saying A2, and then you have an interval, and then you say A2 again, and you have an interval, and you say A2. I mean, it's just, but I mean, you don't, the thing is, like, I don't think you want a duet here. I think you should just have the first oboist play all the top pitches, and then just have the second oboist just come in and play the occasional place where you have want an interval. And then here at the end, I think these should all just be single instruments, right? One clarinet, cut this one oboe, one flute, and of course you have one bassoon and one horn, right? And I don't think this bassoon player needs any help from the low brass. A timpani stroke here should just be, I would say, just have a single quarter note, because the sustain of the bassoon and the double bass will carry it through, or excuse me, not the double bass, the cello. Sorry, let me say that again. The sustain of the cello and the horns, will pretty much make up for anything that the timpani would have in terms of sustain. It would bury it, right, anyway. So you might as well just have a single stroke there and just be as clear as possible with your timpani. Yeah, but it's just really a lot of stacking, a lot of doubling for something that eloquently brings the passage to a close, right? Look at all the beautiful, delicate colors and textures, and you really are doing something here, Frano, in terms of the evaluation criteria, which I said, should tell a story, right? It should have an emotional arc. It should take us on a journey. And yeah, do we have an emotional and timbral progression? We really do, and it's a beautiful one. So why does it have to end so thickly? Right? What is it about this music that has to be so direct? Do you know what I mean? It's like, can't we just fade away? Can't it just, and how does all of this weight set up the harp? Right? The harp will sort of have to not play bisbigliano, but to really play, to play out in order to compensate for the fact that you've got so much weight here and it's not going diminuendo, right? You could do a further diminuendo here and have more of a fade out in the fermata. All right, so, yeah. So and there's also a question here of like competing fermatas, right? Fermati. Right, so you've got a fermata on the first half of the bar here in your strings, and everybody else in the orchestra, and you didn't put one in the celesta part, but that's all right. And then you have a fermata here at the end, right? So which half of the bar is fermata, right? Which one needs to hold more? Maybe the beginning of the bar doesn't need to hold as much as the end of the bar, right? I mean, I think if you really want this, then you need to, but then, like, the distance from here to there is not a fermata, right? So if this is the crucial timekeeping right in here, then this can't be a fermata, all right? Then you could have it tie it forward and then put a fermata on whatever the tie is. Like, it could just be a value of an eighth note or a value of a quarter note that it's tying forward to, and then you put the fermata on that and the rest that follows, right? And then it would make more sense mathematically. All right, well, I don't want to get bogged down in mathematics, so let's continue on. So yeah, so once again we have an imbalance dynamically. And have you heard like what it sounds like to slur an octave in a heavy brass instrument? It's a sort of kind of a slightly, it's got almost foghorn kind of a sound, right? Is that really, do you want that much weight on this and the double bass below piano? Right, so we've had these discussions before, right, Frano, about how, the loud instruments of the orchestra are the brass and the softer instruments are the strings and to an extent the winds, and how, like, the strings will just disappear, right? So maybe they don't disappear in your mock-up, but they will disappear in real life, and you will not really hear the strings here, right? Yeah, so could the decisions that you made here dynamically possibly have something to do with your sound set? Is there a way in the application that you're using now to use Note Performer, or just something a little bit more sophisticated? I'm sorry, I don't want to just keep coming back to the sound set issue, but yeah, I mean, you've been doing these um, challenges for a while, and you're getting better and better, and you're having better and better ideas, and I just feel that that sound set is holding you back. All right. Yeah. All right. So here we've got oboe, clarinet in unison with the first violins, right? And so what you're going to get here is a very thick, not nasal, but just kind of front of the face kind of a sound, and barely any violin because you marked it down to piano. And you'll hear this at the beginning, and then you'll hear a little bit of pizzicato and bassoons working together. Now, did you watch the Pitfalls video when I talked about how the middle voice needed to have some kind of clarity and interaction with the other parts, right? So why do we have these rests in here? Rest, da, rest, da, da, rest, da, da, right? Why can't these elements of the middle voice have a role to play in keeping this really smooth? Why does the left hand of the piano part dictate how you should interpret a kind of a smooth interpretation of that flowing line, right? Because there is a flowing line that goes. If you just listen to the piano part, right, that just it's right there, as plain as day. You can hear how Violina Petrochenko's left hand is playing, a D and then an F sharp, and then she reaches up and she hits the third, which you've scored in your middle strings. And then this comes in, and then there's more thirds, and then this. So if you listen to the line, it is going like this, right? So if you include some of these pitches, like you'd put this E in here, and then maybe put this D in there, right? Then you get this nice flowing line across everything, and you don't have that sort of interrupted. It's just like, da 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 da. Like we don't really have the sense of flow, right, across everything. Which we look at the next page. Look at this beautiful flowing line, and that's because, in transcribing the bottom staff of the left hand, you feel like it's all written out for you and it all works and everything else, but it's really the same thing. It's the same kind of idea, like it's the same flow for the left hand in both bars of the piano score, right? So that's that would be something that I would try to adjust, right? It's just to try to keep it from being so chopped up, right? So yeah, I mean, why can't the strings be mezzo forte? Then you just solve all the problems. Why do we need both the heavy brass going, sort of like, it's almost like one of those things where, like, the bad guy walks in the room and the horns go ba-dum, right? So it just really has that kind of force. So maybe ease back on this, right? If you had two bassoons, you could have your second bassoon player playing this, and then your first bassoon player could play the rest of the flowing thing, and you wouldn't need to bring in the heavy brass at all, right? Because it doesn't. I don't know how much they mix with the more subtle kind of colors that you've got here. The winds and the strings working together, and just a touch of timpani, right? And then here, like, you have your celesta and harp coming in, and I would say that, like, with the force that you've got, like, you've decided to go mezzo forte with everything but the strings. Oops. That you're not really giving your celesta and harp much of a chance to be prominent in the sound picture. The celesta, it almost feels here as if you are not aware that the celesta sounds an octave higher than written, right? Because you have a 2-octave gap between the left hand of the harp here and this celesta part here. So maybe you do, maybe you'd like the 2-octave gap, I don't know. But I would actually put the harp part up an octave, right? So then you could hear it over the mezzo forte of these other parts, and I would also mark both parts forte. I mean, you're not going to get much louder than a mezzo piano out of the cello, and you'll get more of a mezzo forte sound with relationship to the rest of the orchestra out of the harp. But at least it'll be more balanced, right? And you just really have to watch out, like, bringing in celesta and harp, the softest instruments in the orchestra, and just heavily introducing them into a passage that is rife with heavy brass, with high horns all the way up to A here, and heavy scoring in your winds and strings, right? So where in the sound picture does the harp have much of a chance to speak? And once again, I'm sorry to sound like a broken record, but to go back to the to the question of sound set. So is the sound set fooling you into thinking that this will be audible against all the other elements? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I would just say consider that, right? Now, to really look at the roles here, you have bass trombone playing a very flowing line, and no insult to bass trombonists, they're capable of great dexterity and fluidity. However, the weight that you're putting on this bassoonist, people will barely be able to hear the bassoon, and instead they're going to hear like the trombone out front, and really playing rather intensely. And the same thing is true with the horns. The horns will be very, very big here, and especially pushing up to this high A, there'll be a huge pressure on all the other elements, right? And the celesta, as the horns rise, the celesta is gone, right? So its function is pretty much toast. Maybe if this were scored on glockenspiel, right? But you would hear kind of more silvery. But I mean, still, I think you need to rethink this, the way that things balance. But I would just say, first thing, like in an approach that you've got here, don't treat the bass trombone like an additional bassoon, right? With a beautiful flow, or cello, right? I mean, couldn't the cellos have, why do both the cello and double bass just have to be holding these octave Ds? Couldn't the double basses be playing the octave Ds divisi, and then your cellos supporting the bassoons rather than the trombone? You get a much smoother sound. And then these descending sixths in the violins is kind of a cool idea, and the clarinet and the flutes here. Here, I would say a due. That's perfect. That's beautiful. A two. Right. I'm saying a two a lot, and some of it is just people being very slangy in the industry, and in working with them together, and so on, working on scores. And some of it is just like people coming into this to this forum, and kind of, if I say a due, like they think that I'm saying something in doo-wop or something, or they might really not know the context of where I'm coming from if they don't understand Italian, or they don't, so I'm just really trying to balance it, right? So for everybody out there who is snickering about me saying a two, it's just a reality, okay? All right, now here you would not need to say that, because would not need to write this, because it's obvious that this is two people playing, right? All right. Yeah, I mean, so I just think maybe just a little bit, just working on the proportions, and just being aware of the different strengths of the instruments. And I think this will be much better. Maybe the tuba does not need to be mezzo forte when it's doubling the double basses. Maybe it could just be like piano, right? Maybe the bass trombone could be covering this pitch right here, like just swap the two different parts, and also piano. And then here, like, you're having forte on your flutes, and forte on this middle clarinet part. And once again, you are underpowering your strings by comparison. If the winds here are forte and you want a nice balance and a nice blend, by golly, your strings should be mezzo forte. Excuse me, they should be forte as well, right? We should have all forte together, and then mezzo forte on your horns makes more sense. However, pushing into this phrase, this is going to be more like forte, no matter what you do. Especially a two. All right. Okay. So those are my thoughts on your score, Frano. So it's been a very cool journey together, and seeing you develop as an orchestrator and bring me new things and so on and so forth. So I really it would be so interesting to hear your take on the next on our next offering with these challenges. Yeah, because it's a completely different world. A lot of what we've been doing, even though I've had different composers from different sort of qualities of like culture and and influence and so on, but there's a certain relationship with them all. It's a lot of it is from the early 20th century in a time when things were kind of growing and there was a sort of a trade off and a in other words, you hear in the piano score, there's a lot of influence of French music in Barvinsky, right? And so on. So I mean, so the next thing that we're going to be doing, it will be completely from from a place that will force if you want to score in the voice of the composer, you're going to have to really shift how you do this kind of scoring, right? And I think that challenge would just be very educational, whether it's practical to use every day or not, which it probably won't be. But all right, but it'll be a really good exercise. Or you can also interpret it in a very modern way if you like I mean, modernist, like who knows whatever influence, anything from like minimalism to maximalism. All right, well, I've said enough about that, so let's check out the very last score in this batch, which I've really felt great about all the way through, and it'll be a really, really great finish to this compilation. All right, Thomas. Really, really great way to finish out this collection of entries. Um, just a little thing here. Um, you know, if you could fill that in, if you are a I don't know. I don't know how it works for Dorico or Finale, but for a Sibelius user, just double click on any piece of text and then retype whatever you're going to. It just really helps me because like sometimes I have to take screen captures of different scores and organize details, and sometimes I'm in a rush and I really don't want to put the wrong person's score in the wrong place, or the right person score in the wrong place. Anyways, just fill in those details. All right. All right. So let's talk a little bit about balance, and I mean, there are a couple of little weird things though that I want to talk about first. Okay, so let's jump down here. You're saying quarter note equals 88, but that's not a tempo, right? Barvinsky means a tempo to the beat, right? So like if a conductor were beating this out, right? Obviously, it's not. It doesn't have anything to do with like the individual beats of every single eighth note and so on. It has to do with like the conductor's baton, right? So the conductor is going to beat this in 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? So with each group of 3, it's like triplets, right? Everything is in triplets except that it's 12/8. All right, so that means that if your original tempo was 88, right, which I recommended, here you have it slower, and that's perfectly fine. So quarter, it wouldn't be quarter note equals 88, it would be dotted quarter note, right? And you can assign that like this, command or control, and then on your keypad the letter 4 and then the dot, or excuse me, the number 4 and then the dot, and then maybe a space, right? Equal sign, and then 88. Okay? All right, so that's more or less what Barvinsky meant when he said a tempo, and then più mosso. It could be even more. It could be like 92 if that's what you feel, right? All right, so now let's talk about a bit about slurring. Okay, so you have this beautiful thing in here, like you avoid running into that problem of repeated notes under a slur, which I think is great because it gives really beautiful definition to your dotted rhythm, right? And you got that here, and you got it here, and it's just so great. And of course, like you can slur over notes that are in melodic sequence rather than being repeated, right? Okay. But why are you slurring over your brass, right? Why was that? Why did that happen? Anyway, okay, so maybe that was just an oversight. I'll assume. Okay. All right. So now, with those two annoying little details out of the way, let's take a look at the way that this is scored. All right, so I love the idea of stacking tuba, bassoon, and flutes. Right now, you notice that, like in the mock-up, that gives it a very bright horn-like sound. Right, just really kind of overwhelmingly horn-like. So, like, just how much do you want that sound to continue? Like here, you're adding your third horn, and then you're going a deux, a two with your flutes. So. Like, did you notice that it didn't necessarily make the flutes more audible, right? But it sure did make the horns more penetrating, right? Then here you're going diminuendo to piano, and then you just drop out. So that drop out will be audible. I think it would be better for you to go to add the pitch of D, like as maybe a dotted quarter note, and then have a real quick diminuendo on it. And then that way they just sort of seamlessly end together. The big loser in this beautiful idea is the harp, right? So like, there's no way that a harp playing piano in its lower sort of or middle register can really compete. The sound of the horn and whatever is horn-like about the quality of the tuba is going to absorb the harp. Right? That is just one of its things that it does. So like. When it's not so bad when you have a solo horn against a harp, and I've heard, like, there's this one guy here in Wellington, composer and trombonist who has written and arranged many works for trombone and harp, and it works fantastically well just because there's one single trombone. But when you put a stack like an octave like this, it really just sucks all the juice out of your harp. So, like, how do you deal with that problem? Well, one of the things that you could do is just boost it up an octave or something, or you could mark up the the part to say mezzo forte or even forte, or you could do both, right? Maybe have a wider spanning roll. Like you can go hand over hand with harp. You can have these massively big, within reason, like 2-3 octave chords, like with lots of notes filled in, and then the harpist will just take it hand over hand, right? So yeah, so maybe a wider span or higher pitches, louder, certainly, reaching up for this A, that harp is gone. I mean, you can hear it in the mock-up. It's, in that case, I would say, if you've got Note Performer, then you can trust that really it will absorb it. And especially, like with all of this other harmony going on, the middle voice part right in here. You have to really watch out. This is really nicely done, but like here you got the C sustaining, right? But you don't have the G sustaining. If your A clarinets are going to be covering that anyways, or your second A clarinet is going to be covering that lower part, couldn't the second bassoon have that G sustain that's in the piano part? Right? All right, because that's a really important element. Now, the biggest problem with all of this is that you have chosen to interpret the harmony as an E minor chord here at the end, right? B minor going to E minor, but that's not the harmony. The harmony is a G chord with an added sixth. So the melody note of B here does not mean that this is B minor. It means that it's a D major chord at the beginning with the added sixth of B. And then you end with the added sixth of E. And the reason why it sounds like E minor is because you put the melody on the bottom, right? You have an enclosure of the harmonic part, right? So when you do that, you end up with a less impressionistic sound, right? So one of the whole things that makes this impressionistic is the sort of floating quality of, it's a jazz chord. Let's face it. It's, the sixth in it, right? So once you realize that, you might want to reshape, redo everything, right? Because here you're giving away our final, the final E minor chord at the end, right? So like if Barvinsky withholds a lot of information and then gives it to you at the end, right? So here you're filling it in, saying, oh well, here's the information that you needed. But it would be sort of like having a mystery story where you said, so and so killed such and such, and then you have the detective try to figure out who did it, right? So I mean that is an acceptable form of crime story writing, and I've studied the field and made various attempts to write in it. So so that is something that you will occasionally see in a crime novel, but it's not a whodunit, right? So this is more like a whodunit, like where goest thou, right? Well, we end up to an E minor, but the piece is still in G major. Okay, all right, but I will say one thing. Does the treatment of the melody represent an emotional and timbral progression? Yes, it does, and very convincingly so. I really love this. How you start off with the octaves and the bassoon in the middle, and then you make it a little bit more intense. I don't think you need to put a mezzo piano in the middle of hairpins like this. Everybody is, nobody's going to go up to mezzo forte or forte in here unless the conductor really leans on it or something, and that's very unlikely. It'll just be a twitch. Just leave out the mezzo piano here, I would say. Okay, and then you shift over to winds and strings, various things like clarinets doubling the cellos here, and you've got violas working together in octaves with your doubled flutes here and the first violins, and then you really start to pile things on pretty intensely, right? And there's a big surge to forte. This one, you've got me on board with. So, yeah, but it still really feels pretty sudden. You know what I mean? Yeah. I just was checking ahead. I wanted to make sure that I wasn't forgetting something. But yeah, just it doesn't really feel like a bit of a slap in the face here. What if the final destination of Forte were set up a little bit like we headed towards it a bit more gradually, from piano to mezzo piano to mezzo forte to forte, rather than just on the surge, you're just really kind of leaning on it. And then here, this is great. Da da da. Why can't the horns do that? This is a little bit more difficult for them. Da. It's, of course they can do it, but it's not the greatest writing. And wow, it's intense. Like you've got you just have so much weight with 4 horns playing the same exact thing, right? Just big, big, big sound. It'll just really be all about the horns here. I mean, we've got these other instruments playing in here, but wow, and especially with the sound of the tuba adding its overtones to the horns, you'll have an even more penetrating sound, massive sound. Maybe you only need 1 horn player here. And then here, this confused me the most. What's going on in the piano part? It isn't an octave. It is, it is by no means a descending octave, right? It starts off as a sixth, C at this pitch, C in the left hand, and A, and then it walks down, and then the right hand jumps up to an interval of a tenth, right? So I think that we're just by having this, you've already set us up to go straight to E minor and kind of give away what's going on, and then here you very deliberately walk down to E minor. All right, so are you possibly overstating the case here? I like the fade down to triple P. Just put a triple P here. You don't need the niente. You don't need the niente thing. Yeah, just avoid niente hairpins unless you really, really are calling the audience's attention to the fact that this instrument is fading down to absolutely nothing, and they are actually paying attention to it fading down, and they are really amazed by it fading down into nothing, right? And if you're not going to do that for the player, just fade down to triple P, right? Because it's just a waste. It's just a waste of, it is like using a $10 vocabulary word when you just mean something really simple. Like you'd say, how do you feel today? Well, I, had a salubrious breakfast, right? Couldn't you just say that, you really enjoyed your bacon and eggs, so that's, just don't use a $10 word when a simple one, the triple P at the end of the diminuendo mark will do, right? And then you're good. Yeah, and I'm not so convinced here at the viola dropping out, right? Does the clarinets not need any doubling here, or do you really, really want the incredibly dark sound? I don't know. I guess you do, but yeah, just maybe rethinking this, putting back in the upper middle voice, because I just think it would really help things from just being, just almost like March Slav or something, just really shoving us down to the, to the absolute point of where we're heading, right? It just feels a little, maybe a little too deliberate, and something that should be very soft and somewhat sad, right? Or bittersweet. Okay, so, all right, so here we go with this very cool idea right in here. Now, if you've been watching these, you probably heard me. I'm hoping that you watched the evaluation before and you didn't just jump to this. The problem of literally interpreting the left-hand staff, right? And did you watch the Pitfalls video where I talked about how the middle voice needs to interconnect with things, and that we really need to listen to what Violina Petrochenko is doing and how the left hand flows across the parts? This even though it is a literal transcription of what happens in the left-hand staff, is a bit of a betrayal of the flow, right? Not to say that you're I'm not saying you're a traitor, Thomas. That's not it at all. But it works at odds with that just that beautiful sense of flow that that you hear in the playing, right? So why does it have to go rest data, right? Same thing here, rest data. Why can't it just go E, C, E, D, E, F sharp, right? Pitches which are in the middle voice. And then you have this beautiful flow across all the parts. And then trading off to bass clarinet, beautiful exposed contrast to the doubled bassoon and cello that happened before. You're not doing anybody any favors by going piano, pianissimo, mezzo piano, right? This is just it's a big mishmash of dynamics. Just make everybody piano, right? Because submerging the cellos behind the bassoons is not helping either cellist or bassoonist. And then putting this up to mezzo piano, the player is just going to be listening to everybody else playing, and they'll just adjust to their, you could say this is mezzo piano all you'd like, but unless the conductor actually says, hey, could you play a little louder? You're playing mezzo piano, but everybody else is marked piano, so just give us a little bit more, please, right? The truth is, the harp will come in, and so will the winds right in here, and the player will just think that is mezzo piano, even though they're playing piano, right? So just mark it piano. There's I cannot see any reason for the double basses to be slightly louder here. However, the harp, that could easily be marked mezzo piano, mezzo forte even. Okay? I like where the harp is sort of doubling the flutes and the first clarinet and so on. That's kind of a cool idea. But you know what? It would sound even better is if it were an octave higher and we could actually hear it without it being stepped on, right? So the harp really needs a lot of space, even in something like this where you've got a very delicate texture and everybody's playing beautifully, but you're having the harp double other instruments right on their pitch. So basically, you'll hear the sort of glittering sound of the roll, but you may not really hear the golden pitches of the strings, right, sustaining, right, because that just gets absorbed by the wind. So what do? Taking it octave higher, making it a bigger chord. There are a bunch of different ways of getting around it so that so it just doesn't become an afterthought to the winds, which would be a shame. So yeah, you notice here, like with all this close harmony, just that you and with the sense of the D continuing being the sort of our pedal tone, that it doesn't betray the harmony as much. But however, you still have the enclosure problem, right? You have B on top sounding B on the bottom, right? So you're turning this into a B minor chord, and you're turning this into an E minor chord, right, by doing that. I mean, it's not as much as it could be because you've got the D in the bass, as I was saying before. But still, this is an E6 chord, or sorry, a G6 chord, right? So you just want to avoid the sense of E minor. All right, now here we start getting into some cool stuff. English horn, it gets pretty high here. What you have to watch out for is like the real thin sound of the English horn when you really push it up to like D and E, and it's not the most pleasant sound in the world. Go listen to the Rob Roy Overture solo. And since Rob Roy is not really performed all that much, sometimes you just hear oboists playing it as like their English horn excerpt that they're auditioning for. Like it's one of these situations where the the orchestra may ask for it. Can you play the Rob Roy thing on your English horn? And the oboist will say, sure. I'm trying to make second chair. I'm auditioning for second chair, maybe third chair. So yeah, of course I'm going to have to play all the auxiliary stuff, and they'll play the Rob Roy thing, and then they will never play it for the rest of their entire career because it's just not considered to be Berlioz at his greatest. All right, but all that aside, you've got first violins and English horn in octaves, and then here you come up to join, right? So that's a cool idea. And then here you have the oboes playing, into this phrase, and then, and then the violas coming in an octave lower, and so on. I mean, I like the sort of sense of play and the parts sort of trading off with each other. It's kind of cool that you've got nice long bassoon lines, and I think this contrabassoon line right here is going to be pretty damn heavy. I mean, it's really going to be a bit coarse, especially since you don't have any strings doubling it, right? The double basses down there, making it pleasant. And you've got the huge weight of the tuba right in here. This is going to just really be massive. This was the one that I was like looking forward to and saying, like, the first one, I'll grant you. The second one, this big push to forte, it hits like a hammer blow right after this beautiful, soft. Do you really want this big bulge here? This big kind of pimple, right? Just suddenly this big red sore spot kind of sticking out from your music and then going back down to mezzo piano. It just really feels heavy, especially with those, contrabassoon and tuba just suddenly playing that. The tuba basically is going to be what everybody hears. So the bassoon can pretty much go home at this point. I mean, you might as well leave it in, and the cellos too, but really the tuba will just dominate, and the contrabassoon will just add incredible heaviness. But anyways, like, to get back to something I was saying before, I like the long slur on the wind parts, and then how you've sort of sensibly divided this up, into up bow and down bow and so on. That makes a lot of sense to me. But this eradicate these rests and put the middle voice back in, if you would, and then this will really sound smooth, right? Yeah, I'm not so convinced by tuba here either. I mean, tuba is capable of such sensitivity and beauty and playing these lines, but consider what you have it playing against. Right, the flutes and the clarinets. It will really, you have this voice coming from the below like this, as you're trying to kind of hold this very soft, what should be a G6 chord, but is actually an E minor chord, right? So I'm not quite as convinced by this combination. Yeah, but all those things aside, a very cool piece of orchestration. And again, here I don't think you need two flutes on that line. I think one is perfectly fine. It's just got enough weight. Yeah, so I mean, yeah, a really neat bit of orchestration and a it has some really lovely colors in it. So I would just say, watch out about certain things. You might be a tuba player yourself and might be thinking, oh, this is what I want to put in here because I just want the, this is the kind of line I wish that they would give me more. And if that's true, then that's all fair. But just be careful about your proportions if that is the case. Like right in here, I don't, mezzo piano or not. Like the bass clarinet possibly could just go home here because it doesn't really have a strength of combination. But I mean, you could leave it in just to, just on the, just to slightly modify the combination. But it really, it isn't really contributing very much here with the tuba in front of it. All right. Okay. I think I've said enough for this compilation. A really cool collection of works, as I said from the beginning, and just once again, imagination and different directions and different experimentations. Whether I think they work or not is somewhat immaterial because we're just seeing. We're hearing all the different attempts to sort of make this different, make it a unique, everybody's different perspective, and we can compare like which one we think works and so on and so forth, and all of these things can give us ideas for like you might see this melody in the tuba and you might think, oh, it just gives me this great idea in this piece I'm working on. Wouldn't a tuba solo work really, really perfect in this one area? So it's things like that. We all can learn from each other. And I mean, there are so many things that I learn every year when I do this. It's not like I'm this big smarty pants that is just telling everybody what they did right or wrong. It's more to do that I'm just marveling at everybody's at everybody's unique perspective and imagination, and I'm trying to help everybody make it work. Just give you the perspective that I've got about how I would, if you handed me your score and saying, "Oh, I need you to fix this up for me. It's going to be performed day after tomorrow. What can you do for it?" I have to go and have like a gallbladder operation. Right? If that were the case, what would I suggest doing? What would I make changes for? All right. Or if I were coaching you on your score, but to have a more realistic kind of an interpretation, what suggestions would I make? And those are the thumbnail suggestions that I can make. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, website subscribers. And I know I just have not sent out a newsletter in a long time, and I think I'm just getting so hammered here at the end of the year, in many ways, but hammered with work, and trying to get everything done before the end of the year. And so I will probably just send out one when I get back from vacation. And I probably will have to delay a couple other things until January too. So really sorry, everybody. But let's get through these evaluations. I think that's the most important thing. Okay. So thanks, guys. Really loved your scores. And I will see if I can also release one or two more of these and just, have all of the website subscriber entries just finished over the next couple of days. All right. So watch for that, and I'll see you soon.